Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We've got a lot of things to talk about today, so let's go ahead and dive right in. Gold Pendant, Bishop Amelia's pendant, becomes a crystallized bloodstone when used, which can strengthen weapons. It is also a symbol of the aphorism passed down among bishops, heads of the healing church, for generations. Should you desire to learn of it, you should touch the skull upon the altar. So, right at the end there is an obvious discrepancy, and it's the kind of thing we've seen before a few times now. Like with the Kirkhammer, the official English text here doesn't appear to be translated from the Japanese. The Japanese is basically saying to learn the adage passed down among the heads of the healing church for generations by touching the skull on the altar, while the official English merely notes that this adage will open the gates of Byrgenwerth. The thing is, since we've seen this issue before, I think it's actually quite likely that there were a number of last-minute changes being made to some of the text in the game that either were or were not reflected in the final English translation. I've worked on projects in the past where what had been finalized text for me to translate ended up going through a series of revisions, and I can easily imagine things falling through the cracks in this sort of case. Of course, I can't say for sure that this is what happened with Bloodborne, but it does seem to me to be a potential reasonable explanation. What I'm actually more interested in is how small the resulting difference is, despite how English language players and Japanese language players are going to learn different things from this item. People who play the game in English will have already received some guidance to touch the skull on the altar from the note that can be read over to the right upon entering the Grand Cathedral, the one that says to place your hand upon the altar's covering. They may also have learned that the sacred adage of the Grand Cathedral is the password to open the gate to the Forbidden Woods from another note in the Cathedral Ward. Now they learned this adage will open the gates of Byrgenwerth. In Japanese, a player will have access to the same notes saying to touch the altar's covering and informing them that the adage is the password the gate guard is looking for. Then they are told they will learn the adage by touching the skull upon the altar. So functionally, players will have all the same information, but the guidance is a bit clearer in the Japanese. To return to my speculation from earlier, I suspect the Japanese was revised at some point, because, as you'll see in a future episode of this series, the gates leading directly into Byrgenwerth are standing open. The gates that truly block your path are the ones in the Cathedral Ward where the dead guard asks for the password. So while the information presented in English isn't necessarily wrong, it's potentially confusing, while the Japanese is pretty clear. Again, I think this is probably the result of the English translation being based off an older version of the Japanese. But there are also a couple other interesting points to note here. First, let me again point out the use of the word adage. If you can remember back to episode 7 of Translationborne, you may recall that one of the differentiating factors between an aphorism and an adage is that an adage is an expression of wisdom that's been passed down over time, while an aphorism is merely a memorable observation. Well, here we have confirmation that this saying has been passed down for generations by the heads of the healing church, and thus that adage is the more fitting term. Finally, it's interesting to me that the official term used for the head of the healing church is vicar. You may have noticed that in my more literal version, I translated the term as bishop, which I did to represent the even more literal Japanese formulation of either head of diocese or head of parish. Now, I'm not too familiar with the structure of the Catholic Church that all these terms seem to come from in the context of the real world, but my understanding is that the term vicar is normally used to represent the leader of a smaller group than a bishop. In Japanese, it appears to be the difference between kyoku and shokyoku, literally church district and small church district. The implication of the English then seems to be that the healing church is a relatively small organization, which seems fitting since it only appears to have a strong presence in Yharnam. Interestingly, the Japanese used is kyoku, church district, and that's why I went with bishop for my more literal translation of the head of that district, but I still think vicar is an appropriate choice, and as we saw with the term father in Father Gascoigne, we can't always use real-world terminology as a guide here. But I think that's enough on the pendant. Let's switch to talking about enemy types, which are what I have displayed here. Note that there are 2 of them pictured. Now think of the enemies I was just fighting and am about to face again. You may be thinking, those things don't look like beasts so much as they do aliens. And basically, you would be right. The 2 main types of enemies in this game are identified as beasts or kin. Up until now, we've primarily been facing beasts, but now that we're this deep in the Forbidden Woods, we've found our first group of kin. So, why am I bringing this up now? Well, remember all the way back to the first episode of Translationborne when I said to keep in mind that in Japanese there are two terms for hunter? This is where I think that discrepancy gets really interesting. One of the terms used in the Japanese for hunter is the standard one you'd find in any dictionary. This would be karyudo, and my Daijisen Japanese dictionary defines it as a person who hunts professionally. The other term, which we heard Gilbert use in the first episode of this series, is kemonogari. This word is not in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary because it appears to be a game-specific term. It would literally translate to hunter of beasts, and perhaps the closest we get to hearing an English equivalent is when Alfred first greets us and says, "You're a beast hunter, aren't you?" Though ironically, the Japanese term used here is not kemonogari, he's using another phrase in the Japanese, kemono no karyudo, or hunter of beasts. Also, remember that kemonogari is a single word in Japanese, so it would be more like bestivenditor or something using Latin roots, or maybe beast killer as a single word in English. Let's go with beast killer to illustrate the point because it's easier for me to say. So while you're talking to people at the start of the game, most people are calling you a beast killer, though some are also calling you a hunter, and the two terms seem to be equivalent. After all, what a hunter does is kill beasts, right? Only your understanding of these terms is likely to change when you find out you've been tasked with killing more than just beasts. There's also kin out there, alien beings that also seem to be your prey. Suddenly, the beast killer label doesn't seem like it can necessarily replace the term hunter in all cases. To me, this opens up some interesting possibilities. For instance, maybe those who use the term beast killer are implied to be less knowledgeable about the nature of the hunt than those who call you a hunter. I actually spent some time tracking who referred to you with which term in the Japanese for this very reason. But when I heard the lonely old woman refer to us using karyudo, I decided maybe that wasn't a worthwhile line of inquiry. In fact, as far as the actual usage of the terms goes, there doesn't seem to be much differentiation in the Japanese. If there is a grand pattern here, I've failed to discern it, but that makes me think that the decision in the official English to simply translate both kemonogari and karyudo as hunter makes perfect sense, especially since terms like beast killer and beast hunter, or hunter of beasts, are all longer and in some cases sound less natural. I still think it's interesting that the Japanese uses both terms, and I do think that the invention of the word kemonogari has its benefits in terms of establishing an atmosphere and making players think for a while they'll only be facing beasts, but that's really about it. Anyway, now that I've brought up the two main enemy types of the game, let's stick with that theme by examining an item we just got meant specifically to be used against one of them. Gold crystallized bloodstone. A crystallized bloodstone that strengthens weapons and adds various properties. Those of radial type generally have effects relating to physical attack, but this golden one, passed down for generations in the Healing Church, has an effect that particularly raises attack power against those transformed into horrible beasts. It is precisely members of the clergy who become the most terrifying beasts. Therefore, the Church required something set aside to deal with them. So, now that we've established that there is more than one type of enemy, it makes a bit more sense to say that this is a blood gem that specifically raises your attack power against beasts. In terms of translation choices, though, I once again find myself most interested in the final set of lines. Here, the Japanese consists of two statements. The first is a comment on how it is precisely clerics who transform into the most terrifying beasts, and the second is saying that because of this, the Healing Church needs something in their back pocket. The official English combines these into one sentence, and there are a couple aspects of this change I think work nicely, as well as one I think may end up being a bit misleading. So the first change that I like here is the combination of these two statements into one. The Japanese lines are strongly tied together anyway, so this method of presenting the information ends up being concise and understandable. Japanese sentences are often constructed in ways that might work better with a different sentence structure in another language, and I appreciate this kind of flexibility. The point that I find a bit misleading, on the other hand, is the phrasing used in the first half of the official English translation. By saying, when clerics began transforming into unspeakable beasts, the information being conveyed isn't quite the same as a theoretical, since clerics transform into the most terrifying beasts. Yes, both statements get across the idea that clerics turn into beasts, and that when they do, the results can be quite nasty, but the phrasing of the Japanese is meant to be an unequivocal statement that clerics specifically become the most horrifying beasts. and I don't think the official English delivers quite the same message. It even introduces a potential additional question. When did clerics begin transforming into unspeakable beasts? Clearly it's been going on for a while, but how long exactly? The Japanese doesn't really lead into the same line of inquiry, and while this isn't something I see as a huge difference, I think it is there. On the other hand, I really like the second half of the official translation here, even though there's arguably another discrepancy to be found. That's because the Japanese uses a term that's a bit awkward to render into English in this instance, sonai. The relevant definition translated from my Daijisen Japanese dictionary would be a preparation made in case a particular event takes place. So when my literal translation talks about how the church required something set aside to deal with transformed clerics, this is the something set aside to deal with a specific situation. You may have also noticed earlier that I said the healing church needed something in their back pocket, which I think is a good colloquial way of getting across the same idea, but it doesn't really fit the tone of the rest of the item description. The challenge here is to come up with a natural and appropriate way to say the church needed something set aside to deal with the specific situation of clerics transforming into unspeakable beasts that's also concise, because the character space on this item is presumably pretty limited. Combined with the shift in sentence structure then, this is why I really like the solution in the official English. The church needed something to retaliate with. When you do something in retaliation, you are similarly implying the existence of a state of affairs that needs to be dealt with. That one word lets you know that the church is unhappy with the status quo of clerics transforming into the most terrifying beasts, and that they intend to do something about it. Now, these two cases aren't exactly identical. The Japanese is saying the church needed to keep this item set aside to deal with a specific situation, while the official English is saying that the church needed to use this item as a means of dealing with a specific situation. But in this case, the discrepancy is so small, it doesn't bother me. I think it's a great solution to a tough problem, and I think it may even help to explain some of the discrepancy in the first half of the sentence, because that rewording does go well with the idea of retaliation being necessary. But I think that's more than enough on that set of lines. Let's turn to that outfit we picked up. Gravekeeper's Mask. Mask of Doris, Gravekeeper of the Wood of the Forbidden Region. The paleness of the unusual countenance is said to be an imitation of the guardians of the ancient ruins. The two servants who once served Willem at Bergenworth observed the holy mystery of the underground ruins on their master's orders and both lost their minds. It is said that one became the password gate guard and the other became the gravekeeper of the forest. They served their master, having become even more loyal servants in their madness. There's also one unique line on the robe. Gravekeeper's Robe. Countless bloodied ritual implements hang from its back. And there is one more unique line here. Gravekeeper's arm wrappings and skirt, stained with the vestiges of bloody rituals. So there are actually a few interesting translation choices here, but the one that interests me the most combines two aspects of translation that we've touched on before: identifying the gender of a character and translating a name from Japanese into English. Because the Japanese is sending somewhat mixed signals in terms of whether this is meant to be a male or female character. On the one hand, there's the character's name, as well as the original Japanese used in the naming of the leg piece for this set. The Japanese pronunciation of the name here is Doresu, which has been rendered fairly literally into the official English as Doris, which is a female name. According to the website behind the name, Doris is the Portuguese version of the female name Dolores, which means sorrows. That, and the more literal version of the name of the leg piece in this set, which is referred to as a skato, or skirt, both point to this being a female character. On the other hand, there is some information in the Japanese text of the description that implies this is a male character. In the final line, which in my literal translation I've begun, "They serve their master," the word I've translated as they actually uses a masculine pronoun in the Japanese. This is done by adding the character da, which is a way to indicate a plural, to the end of the character kare, which in this context means he. The resulting meaning of he plural would seem to be an indication that this character could be male. The problem is, none of this information is particularly definitive. The name Doresu could also be spelled out as Doles in English, which is more common as a last name and doesn't indicate gender very well. The Japanese for skirt is also an umbrella term for a leg covering like that of a skirt. And while there is a word for kiruto, or kilt, it's not hard to imagine skato being used instead, especially since kiruto is also the Japanese word for a quilt. As for the use of a masculine form of plural, we've seen the dead body of the guard who asks you for a password at the gate, and it was male. So it's possible that the he plural being used here is simply a form of they that includes one male and one female character. This particular character is never specifically identified as being either male or female. So what do you do in a situation like this? Well, again, the default solution is to go with a male character unless otherwise indicated, and that could explain this choice. I probably would have gone with an interpretation of this character as female because the name makes more sense to me that way, but then again, maybe the best thing to do would have been to treat the character as gender neutral or non-binary. Anyway, let me know what you think about this or anything else in the episode, and until next time, thanks for watching, everyone.